Hello, everyone. This is Curt, Martin, and Francis from the Natural Law Institute. This is Friday, October 25th. It's our Q&A session. Q&A sessions are where you submit questions. We have a form which is attached to this, which will be posted underneath this video. And you put it in questions and we answer them. Usually what happens is Francis reads the question, Martin gives the short correct answer, and then I add color and detail. And it's usually pretty good. I'm kind of impressed at the quality of questions that have been arising over time. But there seems to be this interesting correlation between, I'm teasing Martin now, between the quality of questions and Martin's degree of sarcasm. I haven't quite figured out what that formula is yet. Have you, Martin?
Yeah, sure.
All right. How many? We got quite a few questions today. Yeah, we got a lot. Oh wow! Somebody sent. Eric sent a lot of questions. Well, all right, let's go.
All right. Question one: who owns the Fed?
The enemy.
Okay. So, all right. So, here's how it actually works versus what people think it works. It's set up as it is a board of governors, right? It's set up as a private corporation. It has its shareholders are the Federal Reserve banks, and Federal Reserve banks are required to hold shares in it. The stocks are fixed, in other words, they can't be sold or traded. The purpose of the stock is really to maintain legal ownership of the Fed instead, rather than financial interest in it. This is not an uncommon way of doing things at this scale, but it is done. I'm going to see if I can look up something else here. Yeah. So that's really it. Now, the reason the Fed is independent is so that the policymakers can't destroy the monetary system. However, in practice, the politicians do influence the Fed and their decisions.
I think just like in ancient times. Sorry, Martin.
That influences them back, which is worse.
It influences them what?
So the Fed influences policymakers.
Oh, okay. All right, so they influence them back, I see. All right. So you're going to say something, Francis?
Yeah, I was going to say, just like in ancient times, when you have the kings and other bankers, they influence each other. The kings typically have powers of violence, and bankers are also people, just as we find out what the kings did to the Templars.
Yep.
But the other form of influence is far more
insidious.
I want to say insidious, but then I'm looking for the word that subtle. Yes, there's more subtle over long acting, but then the it's in the short term you don't see its effect as acutely as the physical violence, but in the long term, the effects are monumental.
Right.
I'll bring up the quote from Meyer A. Rothschild: "Give me control over a nation's currency. I care not who makes its laws."
Yes. Well, all right. So let's help the poor right wing here, and the libertarians who are equally silly about this. All right. Regarding the invention of fiat money, which is the capacity of a population to borrow from its future self. This innovation is as important as the invention of money by the Greeks and the invention of credit money later on. This, and certainly stock as a form of token in the by the uh, people in Dutch. So, so this is a set of technologies, and the point I want to make is that regardless of how everyone feels, uh, the, the 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 cognitive necessity of money being a store of value rather than assets being a store of value is a mistake. The purpose, the what's happened with our ability to generate fiat money, our ability to understand macroeconomics at a large scale, is that we're trying to not encounter a point where there is a shortage of money that constrains growth. And so the fiat money solves the problem of a shortage of money. Now, why do libertarians? Because libertarians, of course, are from the Jewish wing, just as classical liberals are from the Anglo wing. Um, Libertarians don't like this because what it means is they can't earn more interest because of a scarcity of money, instead of um, and they're claiming they have a right to the stability of the price of money or the purchasing power of money. Whereas money being a public good, you're trying to maintain a public good for the population, but if you want to store your value, you store it in something else other than the means by which people produce economic velocity. So I always view the libertarians as ignorant and childish, wealthy fools. Uh, that's more charitable than Martin will say about libertarians. But it's a problem for conservatives as well, who both understand this issue also incorrectly. One of the values I saw in Bitcoin is if it gets large enough, of course, it could fix this particular problem. There's not enough gold in the world to fix use gold, because what we'd like to be able to have essentially is a fixed currency, right? A fixed money to store value in, and liquid money to conduct trade in. And we actually have various things like that, but they're only available to very wealthy people. So my view of the fiat money Fed criticism is that the problem is the state's debt being expressed through Fed by and the state being rescued by the Treasury, who owns the Fed, rather than either the Fed's existence or the concept or the institutional fiat money. These are just mistakes. I don't see why we think that people who save money have a right to the to other people's income or gains that were produced by other people simply because they saved money. In other words, that's a form of rent seeking, which is of course why our Jewish friends have in history made this argument. It deprives them of the capacity, fiat currency, and the Fed deprives them of the capacity to rent seek by holding hard capital.
So I have a couple of
But they hold
questions.
the Fed. Oh,
Sorry, my nose is bothering me this morning.
Martin, you go first.
well, they themselves hold the Fed, so they get to rent seek in other ways.
Do you know of the name of any shareholder the of the Federal Reserve that is not a Federal Reserve bank? No. That's the problem, is people think it's privately held. It's not. You can invest in the banks, right? And then you can use the banks to exploit the fiat money system, which is what's done, which is what our people are exasperated about, and which BlackRock is currently the greatest sinner that since the oil barons, age of the oil barons. But no, it's not. The Fed is not privately owned; it's owned by the banks. And I don't know why the right has this conspiracy theory. It's not true.
Wait, so the Fed is owned by the member banks, but who are the majority? Oh, who are the majority share owners on these member banks, and who sits on the board of directors? I mean, eventually these entities are owned by someone, or some other entities are owned by someone.
Give me 1 second. I'm going to find it real quick.
I guess to get to the bottom of this question, I guess I'm trying to figure out whether so that in the right circle there's the conspiracy theory that the banks are owned by the enemy, and because when you look at the governors, they're almost predominantly from that enemy group. My question is whether that is the truth, or member of this group just tend to rise to that position because of their particular propensities, or are those two really the same thing?
I'm trying to find the list here. Give me a second.
I have read about its origin somewhere, and yes, Jews were involved in the beginning, and it was used to finance the First World War. Something, I'd have to find it.
I think it might be from that short Battle for Europa.
I haven't seen that.
We're trying to find the list here. Yeah, it's just I'm just trying to get a list of the member banks, or the member banks. Who what are the largest member banks? I know who they are, but I want to know if there's anybody thinks surprising in here. Right. So the usual suspects: J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citicorp, Bancorp, PNC, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Capital One, right? And so, technically speaking, they are required to hold shares, but and technically speaking, it's a nonprofit organization. And but so what I wanted to get across was that the Fed is not owned, the Federal Reserve banks are not owned, but the private banks that uh, the private banks that are major, that use the Federal Reserve banks, are required to hold stock. Actually, I've got to click wrong here because I haven't looked at it in a while. They have a huge influence on the economy, blah blah blah. Yeah, I know all this. So the point being is that the distribution of influence that people are worried about is pretty highly distributed among those banks. It doesn't mean they don't have influence, because of course they're crying all the time, but it works the other way too, is that most of these banks are too big to fail. And even networks of banks, like most home mortgages, and especially most business property, is owned by local banks. And when things happen, the Fed's got to rescue all those things, right, in order to preserve the trust in the dollar, right, which is everybody's interest. So there is an interest in both sides. There's a mutually beneficial interest in both sides. So my argument again is that the problem isn't that Federal Reserve and its organizational structure, from my understanding. My understanding is the problem is the federal government is going into. I didn't realize, because Remember, I switched in 2009 to 2012 to the law. So up until 2009, I knew everything that was going on everywhere. But so I've been out of paying attention to this, the debt, national debt, for quite a while. But holy shit, the rate at which things are going right now is terrifying. So the problem is the government. The problem is the government and their debt spending. They have problematic debt spending, partly because they're a government, and partly because democracy forces them to. And from our perspective, our relative position in the world, because of our loss of economic advantage, our export of jobs, et cetera, like that, and the 60s, the 60s, the World War II through 1960s creation of economic dependency means that basically half of the population, one way or another, is dependent on the federal government's distribution of funds. So when we're in this position, it's not the Fed that's the problem; it's the government that's the problem. And I think, while we complain about the Fed, it's because though libertarians and we understand how this thing works, sort of, and it really bothers us because it affects our money. But it's really the Fed is basically an insurance organization, right? That's really what it is doing. It's ensuring the public has a stable money supply, and the government is fucking with it on one end, right? And the banks getting into speculations are fucking with it on the other, and it's trying to maintain this equilibrium, despite that it has limited power control. And they're just as afraid at the Fed that they'll be stacked like this, just as the Supreme Court is afraid they'll be stacked. So it's really our government is out of control. Our government is controlled because the people are out of control, and the people are out of control because they were baited into hazard in order for people to get elected to move things to the left. It's really upsetting when you work through it. All right, did I make my point there, Francis?
I think you revealed what's underneath the iceberg. It's all a web of, to me, it's all a web of entangled interests. It's hard to say who's a villain, who's a good guy, because there really isn't any.
No, the truth is that,
Yes,
I used to be very deep in the economics of this country, and I was one of the people who's arguing against the Greenspan's belief that these financial instruments were not cascadable, right? Which they did, they were.
Wait, say again. You were arguing against Greenspan, and what was his statement?
Greenspan was saying there was a couple of things happening at the time. It was the first time at the time where we had a lot of people who come up through the computer science, and they're computerizing and softwareizing the stock market and the financial system. So that was going on, right? At the same time, they had this. What's the formula? Oh God. Anyway, there was a formula. There was a risk assessment that was put out.
I think I know what you're talking about. For options?
Just in general, right? Yes.
Oh.
And then finally there were financial instruments that came out. This is all what we would call mathiness, but we're more sophisticated than these guys are really. I mean, and their incentives are to try to make use of it. And so we got loans because of this sequence, right? And so that all blew up. So during the time, I was thinking, well, they're making, these are not decisions of malice or self-interest. They're errors that are based on the limitations of human knowledge and the way these systems work together. So what I used to follow, look at Greenspan, like, here's a guy who actually looks at the economy not as a Keynesian, which is in these abstract numbers, you can't tell the difference between something and not. He actually went down into industries like cotton in particular, and he would see how the whole industry worked from the guy who picks the cotton all the way up through its final distribution worldwide. So when you do that, you begin to get an operational view of the economy, not an abstract one, not a mathical one, but you understand?
Of course, I agree with your assessment of Greenspan, because Greenspan, his claim to fame was in the 1950s. He basically figured out what the U.S. military is doing or what the U.S. government is doing, and they thought that he was a spy. All he really did is being a geek and went down to the very basic levels and figure out how these
Correct.
inventories flow.
Correct. So Greenspan was an operationalist, right? He's simply looking at, not at the mathematical aggregates, which is an idealist, but an operationalist. So back then I was, I knew that they was making a mistake, but it was not like I thought they were being irresponsible or foolish. They actually believed it, all right? And smart people believed it. And so if we go roll forward, we have this problem of these guys are in largely keep coming into relatively uncharted territory, while at the same time trying to create innovations, while at the same time the government is being ridiculous with the future. What happened in 2008 is what libertarians, I was among them, predicted, which is that the cycle theory would be proven, which is that you can't kick things down the road. That the common man's language is, you can't kick things like this down the road because you're basically accumulating this, what we would call distortions or tensions in the system that we call the economy. So that blew up in 2008, and that's why you'll notice that economists were really popular until 2009. They were on news. They were on the news all the time. They wrote articles all the time, and they went dead quiet. They've been dead quiet since, except for Paul Krugman, who continues to lie, cheat, and scheme to the American people because he hates America and he hates white people. Anyway, well, and I'll add Brad DeLong and Joseph Stiglitz in there too. So in any event, where was I? So in any event, I think our criticism of the Fed is overstated and largely misplaced. The problem is we have a democratic system of government without the system.
No, we don't.
Limited. What?
It's a show. There's very little democracy in it.
Okay, but what happens is you appeal to the masses by selling them freebies or discounts until you've basically created a system that has so many debts that it's inescapable, and that's what's happened. So this is the problem of democracy. It always ends up in the same place, and it always ends up in the same place because there's without an independent Supreme Court, a constitution within the Constitution, a system of measurement sufficient to stop this stuff, it always gets out of hand.
I think we have an oligarchical form of government that placates the people via circa and the penne. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
By putting on this democracy pony show. And
Yep.
most people are none the wiser to see through that. And we have borrowed so much, because credit creation is essentially borrowed from future generations. We
Yes.
borrow so much from our own future generations, and by the U.S. and making the U.S. dollar world reserve currency, borrow from people all over the world's future generations, and are essentially writing them a blank check at an alarming rate.
Right. And so what I'd like, if we could sort of, if you back me up here, Francis, if I can make it. The point I'm trying to make is we like to criticize the Fed, right? But it's actually the government that's the problem. The Fed's just acting as an insurer, right? To do the best it can, despite the government on one end and the private sector's use of the Fed's insurance as extending their own capacity to profit from overextension of risk.
I think
Effectively ensuring moral hazards.
They're insuring moral hazards, correct?
I was going to say, I think something could be said about the Fed creating an incentive for the kings or for the government
Correct.
to rob from our future. And
Right.
it took me so long, and I kick myself for not realizing this, but I finally came to the realization of what they're doing. They're borrowing from our future generations, inflating that borrowed time away by paying them back or maybe in case of default, not paying back at all, was deflated time. They're basically robbing life from the future.
Yes. Well, I mean, and the I guess the problem we have is that if you look back when this was going on in the 30s, all this debate, right? And if you follow it forward from there, people, it looks like they're, because we tend to practice selection, right, bias in our view of history, we tend to say, well, they knew this. I'm like, they didn't know it. Some people knew it, right? And when they say they knew it, they believed it or speculated on it. But it's only with, it's like the 2008 thing. All right, the libertarians are right, Austrians are right. That's the, now Austrianism is fully incorporated into economics, meaning that cycles actually happen and they're inescapable, right? So there's this learning curve. I mean, if you go back to who's the guy that's always brought up during the Nixon administration, Volcker.
Hmm.
You go back to, I hope I got him right in the right time frame. You know, these guys were theorizing, right? They were doing the best they could with the knowledge they had. It's only sort of now, it's like a lot of things in the world. Somewhere around 2000 to 2010, we started a lot of stuff we suspected about the world came to roost. And we sort of feel that after 2008, 2010. So all this stuff, I mean, our work itself is part of this realization. You know, I always say that the IQ thing, right? The IQ thing, the sex differences and sex differences thing, the race differences thing, that happened in 2000, 2012, and 2018, right? That all those pseudoscientific beliefs were falsified during that period.
Do you think the reason behind that is information revolution? Because
Correct.
at Volcker's time, it's impossible to gather econometric data,
Correct.
or not only gathering, but like compute. Even if you have that data, to be able to compute and disprove certain models. Whereas in the late 2000s or in the late 1990s or 2000, and especially 2010s, computation and data gathering has gotten to a level where you actually can do that with big data and so on.
Correct. So let's give the devil his due. We had the computational revolution come about, and they tried to be cunning, and it didn't work. Right? We got the 2008 crash out of it. Then we got the sort of knowledge that came out of that, and we got this mass distribution of knowledge. Whereas, I mean, I can roll over here and I can turn them here and pull up data on anything, right? I mean, if you know how to work a couple of websites in the federal government, economic data there is, I mean, you could spend your life on it. People do, right? But even on silly stuff like anything you want to know, I couldn't have done my work on the unification of the sciences until this era. I mean, I was working in books back in the 90s, right up until the mid 2000s. All of a sudden, you've got every book in the world out there, every piece of data in the world available to you, and instead of going to the library, looking up something, right, on microfiche, or because that was a pain in the ass, right? And then I would order books from libraries from the library, right?
Yeah, I remember that.
Right? You know, and it would take like 3 weeks to get the book or longer. And then you'd read the book and give it back. You can't, today you say, instead of having a question where you have to order 5 books, read 5 books to get the answer, You just go online and run a couple of searches. So yeah.
It's sex differences and race differences that to be proven, and everyone throughout history understood them, and these were just blatant lies that contradicted daily experience of people that interacted with the other sex and other races.
I think that there's a problem. One of the common problems is the left and the feminine. They think in terms of want, and the right thinks in terms of is. Right, and so they operate on idealism, and we operate on realism, and never the twain shall meet. All right, did we kill this one?
The answer is not even allow them into science. Just when they start making hypotheses, tell them to shut up.
Well, I don't think telling them to shut up is the answer, but be able to falsify it and prove that they're wrong. That's the answer.
All right, so we killed this one.
It should be considered false by default unless they can prove it.
To answer Curt, to answer your question, I think we nailed this one, but I have a corollary to this in terms of solution-wise. So we talked about this before, in that the accumulated capital versus borrowing time from future. Technically, one should be the accumulated capital, stored capital. That's money, because that's your savings. Borrowing from the future is credit. The difference being that when you accumulate it by not spending your surplus, you actually don't have a debt on the other side of the ledger. Whereas when you do create a credit, there is a debt that the result as an instrument. And one of the fundamental, in my opinion, one of the fundamental issues is that both of these are measured using the same unit of exchange, US dollars or whatever.
Correct.
So can we solve this problem, or begin solving this problem, by bifurcating between the two, and then even have different representations, like you have your actual money and then you have your credit, and these two cannot, or maybe they can be exchanged, but not via some invisible or really liquid.
You're saying the same thing as I was saying earlier, which is you want your store of value, which is Bitcoin. Your Bitcoin, which is your semi-liquid store of value, and then you want your hard assets, which is your house and your investments and whatever. So you have your non-liquid assets, your semi-liquid assets, and then you have your dollars, which is the liquid asset. And you have this chain available to you. And even then, on top of that, we should demand others have their insurance, which is basically their retirement funds, etc., saved. So we should have. So you can't get at it until you need to. You can get it if you have time to liquidate it. You can easily liquidate your Bitcoin, and your cash is liquid. I think this is the way to think about it. And the thing is that the government can use cash, and it will affect the conversion rate between your Bitcoin or whatever and your cash disposal.
Exactly. My point is, because the government uses legal tender, and this legal tender is used as a common denominator across all, it conflates the stored versus borrowed time.
Correct. That's a really
so if we make the barrier harder, in some special cases you can still permeate, but if we make the barrier harder, would that solve the problem? Like, for example, Bitcoin is just Bitcoin. By the way, I don't think Bitcoin is a great store of value, because your store of value is always going to increase, hopefully, in a society, and Bitcoins are only ever 21 million. Right. So it's a deflating.
I was trying to you just use something that people could understand, but what you're essentially saying is that all cash, all dollars are credit money.
Right. Well, I mean that they are.
Yeah, no, I know. I just wanted to get the point across that. Well, that's what you're saying.
I mean, it says right on here. It's shoot, this is not a $1 bill, is it? Yeah, Federal Reserve note. It's an IOU. It's a credit.
Well, that's actually a really good. I think that little series we just
Right.
exposes.
Okay,
Yes.
I guess. Well, the
Well,
camera
I mean,
can't focus.
material it is, right? I mean, is there anything backing the dollar anymore, like, other than momentum of the economy?
At one point, I would say the economic output of the United States.
Yeah.
But that I don't think that's true anymore. I think the only thing that's holding the dollar now is still the conventional military force of the United States. And even that is getting eroded away very quickly. And maybe it's just momentum because nobody else has any sense. I mean, for world trade to continue, nobody wants to become the dollar because to have that reserve currency means you got to run a current account deficit.
Correct.
Foreigners has to have your money to spend. So China obviously don't. I don't know whether China don't want to step into that position or they don't have the capability to run into that position because they themselves are a producer. They can't.
They don't have the domestic consumption.
Right. Their consumption sucks.
Yep. We have the. Well, this is why Trump was saying that. I know he meant it because he speaks in hyperbole to make people think. He said, "Well, we could just convert all back to tariffs, right?" I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah.
But he was trying to make a point, which using hyperbole, which the left cannot comprehend, and the right intuitively comprehends. But the point there is that we have a consumer economy, and its question is if anybody else is going to have one, right? If everybody's going to have one at all. And like I keep saying to people, they're worried about if the world goes to shit. I'm like, the world's goes to shit. Money's coming here. How do I catch a cold? Because I think I have cold instead of just allergy. How do I catch a cold when I live in a fucking shoebox? Anyway,
It goes around.
all right. So do I get to do I love to fuck with Martin. So Martin, have we proved Martin right or wrong that the Fed is the enemy?
I don't think we've done either, really.
I love you, man.
Certainly ensuring moral hazards against our people. That is an enemy activity.
They're ensuring the moral hazards because the triangular relationship between the banks, the government, and the Fed forces them into the position. All right.
Who said it? Too big to fail means too big to exist.
Yeah, I think that's about right. And I wonder what historians will write about this period. All right, we should move on. Question 2. Why didn't the Native Americans in North America develop civilization as complex as the Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas?
My guess would be it's something to do with scale and with resources. Never having that much available. Size of the population. Just guesses.
I wonder if it has anything to do with defendable geography. North America continent, it runs north and south. And when you look at the Mayans, Aztecs, and the Incas are way the heck down south. Like, it's hard to get to the Incas. Aztecs, they're in the middle, right? Jungle, again, like for anyone south of them. Well, actually, no, there wouldn't be anyone to the south of them that can possess a threat to them, because humans move from the north to south in American continent, not the other way around. And so South America civilization developed even later than North and Central America. But North America is just too wide open.
Basically, that's the right answer. Couple of it's basically geography and climate. All right. they have a permanent growing season there, right down there, right. The people are compressed into smaller areas. The area is highly fertile no matter where you are, right? So you have fertile area. You have the mountains and the valleys. You have lots of rain. You have lots of sunshine, um, and it's actually not that big an area. So trade is possible. So which one of them is the who developed the floating farms?
The floating what?
Farms.
Floating farms. They
Floating
base
farms.
yeah.
That's
Oh, I mean like
me.
mountain terraces?
No, hold on. I'll look it up. Give me a second. Which Mesoamericans developed the it's the Aztecs. The Aztecs.
The Chinapas.
Uh, Chinampas, yes. Um, so was the Aztecs. So I mean, you can't steal. You can't steal from. It was pretty smart. Um, so anyway, the real answer is it's really geography and climate. I mean, you could grow stuff down there 24, right? 724, 365.
I'm just reading on the Chinapas. I had no idea those existed.
Yeah. So, if you can produce that much food that reliably, that consistently, and especially when it's really hard to burn it, steal it, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
it's a really effective. They basically industrialized farming due to the capacity of their geography to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at like the use of the river valleys by most civilizations, they used the lake structure instead, right? And they built instead of bringing irrigation into, they did. We don't want to discount that because South Americans did do a pretty amazing job with irrigation. But in this particular case, the Aztecs were really successful at creating essentially um, 20, 365-day a year industrial farming,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it was also easily defensible. They were also really nasty fuckers, by the way. So,
Oh yeah.
we don't
Human
want to talk about.
sacrifices and everything.
All right. So that it's really that simple. The if you go to guns, germs, and steel, um, it's just look. You have to be in a place long enough to develop uh, enough capital, right? To be able to produce enough returns, to produce enough capital, to be able to develop a civilization that can produce a hierarchy of specialists that can develop uh, skills so that you have something to trade with other people, right? It just takes time. So I mean, if you look at where they were in when Europeans got here in the sort of 1400s, they were they they were different because they were younger, but they were if you could compare them to not probably not to the Mesopotamians necessarily. So but you could compare them to some of the Middle Eastern civilizations certainly. Uh, 3,500 to 4,000 BC. So they were just like everybody said. They were time lagged because they got there later, right?
Mm-hmm. And it's all because of geography.
It's just geography. Now the thing that's been interesting is that we
Mm,
have you have stuff that pops up in there, and it's speculative science. It sounds like it's nonsense, and it ends up being true. So it is true that the Southeast Asians, the island people, what's that? Before the flood area, the air the southeast
Mm-hmm. It was
Pacific
one continuous
landmass.
large like peninsula or something.
Right. So, and that's still pretty. I mean, it's not that far underwater today. So before the ice melted, there was there. So those people did make it, and not in large numbers, but in small enough numbers to leave a genetic trace into South America. So we had those people there, but they didn't have enough. I suspect they're from they were from an earlier generation that had the 70s range instead of the 90s range that we see in most Southeast Asians today, and so they didn't get far. But if you look at but then the first wave comes down, pretty much wipes them out, and the second wave comes down and pretty much wipes everybody else out, and we get these sort of three waves. There might have been four. I don't know. I'm not a specialist in it. I know about the three waves. Three waves of settlement of people that came either from the south across the ocean or down the land bridge. So it's really interesting. I found it what I had most fun with studying what I guess called Siberian Americans is probably the right term, is that they expressed so various different branches of neoteny. In other words, the genetic diversity of these groups is fascinating to look at, and the rates and differences of neoteny in them are really fascinating. So I wish I had, I wish I was going to live 1,000 years so I could study all the things I want to study, but I would like to be able to study the genetics of how quickly those neotenic graduations happen, because they look like they happen really fast.
Wait, you mean they're not their genetic diversity wasn't because of the mix from different people, but rather they evolved in neoteny, like locally at different rates very quickly.
Very quickly, and it's fascinating how diverse it is. The problem in Eurasia, is that the East Europeans and East Asians, well, we look pretty different today, but Europeans, East Asians, and South Eurasians and Africans all looked really different in the past. It's only the age of agrarian expansion that has, especially among Asians, unified the Asian more phenotype, and that has made similarities between the South Eurasian and European phenotypes. So, and of course, Africa is, because it's so of its issues of geography, exchange, and the necessities of different regions, has maintained a pretty high diversity of phenotypes. So it's really farming that made us more similar, and that was only 10,000 years ago. So it just, I don't know. I don't know if you guys seen that grid I've made of from the lower right to the upper left of the evolution of morphology, but what the rate at which Siberian Americans developed a huge diversity is fascinating to me. I really wish I could study it. I'm surprised more people don't. I think that more people study this stuff because they want to have political agendas on one end, or they're avoiding political agendas on the other, instead of just looking at something where there's not so much crosstalk like there is in Eurasia, and looking at the Amerindians, because it's fascinating.
If I'm quote God, or if I have some kind of incentive to spread humanity across the cosmos and compute evolutionary computation at the fastest rate, I would study this and then purposely see humanity on different planets with different scales, and then figure out then try to engineer somehow which ones are gonna evolve at the fastest rate.
Yes. What game, wasn't there a game like Populous or something like that back in the day? There was a game sort of like that.
Civilization.
Because what's his name? Because That game designer is quite old now.
Sid Meier's.
So yeah, no, is
Yeah,
it Sid?
Well, Sid Meier's created Civilization, or maybe
did
you're talking about somebody else.
It might be Sid.
Or are you talking about like the late 90s, early
Molyneux, Peter
2000s?
Molyneux. It's Peter Molyneux.
Yes.
It came out in '89.
Oh, okay, that was before my
So
time.
he made a bunch of games. Um, uh, he made a bunch of games that were on this theme, evolution. Of course, Civilization is the one that took root, and I spent way too many hours on. I mean, I tease Rudyard that he's basically a product of adversarial competition in Civilization, because he would just try this, this. So he thinks about the world as a game system.
So do you like that now that you're actually enshrined in video game?
Yeah, I would think that was great.
So one of our guys who plays this game.
Is that what I get? I got defense minister. Is that what they call me?
Was it defense minister or?
I think it's defense minister.
Yes.
You get a discount
by
on
making
corruption.
you the leader of defense minister. Wait, okay, I'm just gonna read it. What did he say?
Anyway, Curt brought up diamonds, and I don't know to what extent I trust anything he says. It's another ethnoscience. He just attributes everything to geography so as to deny anything special about the European genes.
Of course. I would say the same about. I would say the same thing about. What's his name? The historian that I can't stand. Harari. Some degree, I'd say it about one of my heroes, which is Fukuyama. Is that a lot of these guys are great historians. In other words, they grasp, they're great at documenting history, but their conclusions from it are not great. Which it's pretty common. It's actually hard to be right.
So this person who picked you as a defense minister says the research speed and efficiency increase, my production efficiency increases, and my daily political power gain decreases slowly over time. He also slowly, meaning you, slowly decreases corruption debuffs.
Yeah, it's another Hearts of Iron. That mod.
I think it's true. I mean, I feel very proud that someone would make those algorithmic suggestions, because I think they're true.
Based on your work.
Yeah.
It means they've actually read your work. So just for the audience, this is what I was talking about. If you zoom in, there's Curt. Well, Curt, of course, you can't see this, but it's on the YouTube video.
I understand. So what? This is an add-on or
It's an add-on to Hearts of Iron 4. It's a mod for Hearts of Iron. So Heart of Iron, I guess, is the World War II strategy game. I think actually pretty hardcore because it's essentially like if you were to give this game to the general staff, a German and American general staff in World War II, they would totally use it. Like they put their colonels to go, you play this game for 2 years and give me like all sequence of eventual results. That's your job.
You know, the guys, this is another example of intelligence differences. I find the guys who are really good at these strategy games have an extraordinary amount of working memory. I can't figure out how much of it's, well, you've learned it and how much of it's natural. I'd have to look at it, but I get bored with them because it's basically, from my view, I have to do too much counting. I remember a lot of stuff. And it's not that interesting, but I watch people who are very good at it, and it's impressive to me. All right, Did
Yeah, let's
we
go to
kill that
question
one?
3. Yes. I think we killed it like 10 minutes ago. Question 3. Sincerely, why do you think NLI will have success fulfilling its objectives?
I don't know that it will. Our odds are perhaps dire. The sorts of reforms we are proposing are of the same sort that other countries tried to implement in the past and got promptly destroyed by the Anglosphere, and now we're trying it in the center of the Anglosphere. But what is the alternative? Waking up the normies, enjoying the decline, supporting acceleration to make things intolerable, laying down and dying?
That's,
What else are we supposed to be doing?
Well, I'm just going to add I went into this venture knowing that the chance of success is pretty slim. Boy, we gotta try.
exactly.
The other day, in fact, I had a similar conversation with my wife. So there was a famous novelist in contemporary China, and he once wrote about this analogy. So in his time, it was the end. He lived in the end of the Qing dynasty, the start of the what do you call it? The nationalist movement, and so on. So it was a very turbulent time in China
Yeah.
in the early 20th century. He likened the society back then as if everybody was trapped in a iron house, they can't get out, and the iron house is being heated up from the bottom gradually. I guess you could say it's almost like boiling frogs. And then he and a few others were most people are asleep, but he and a few others, or he himself, he's as naturally awake. So the moral dilemma is: do I wake the other people, knowing that you can't really get out of this thing, but at least everybody dies conscious, or just let them pass away in their sleep? I tend to think that by doing this and waking up as many people as we can, we have a chance at getting through this alive.
I agree. I mean, the way I
Right.
look at it is you can't really know. We can't know how successful we'll be. I look at it as the worst that will happen is that we'll have an instruction manual for people of the future. That's the worst possible outcome, right? Um, the the next one up is maybe we'll influence what happens. I think that's I think that's likely. Um, how much is that influence? 1%, 10%? I don't know. I have no idea. But there's a non-zero chance that we could bring this about. So when you look at the field of possibilities, the real issue is there isn't anyone else. It's actually really what we do is really hard. Um, no one else has done anything close to it. No one else has tried other than the Marxists since the founders and the French. So I look at this as a really profound effort at innovation, and I if we don't do it, then no one will do it. And so we can either buy a percentage chance, so to speak, or we can buy no percentage chance. And I can't just, well, there's a significant part of me that regularly says, wow, I could go back into business, make a bunch of money, go back to living wherever I wanted to and whatever. I can't bear the moral burden of not doing this.
And especially I have children. I just picture myself 30, 40 years down the line, at the end of my life, my children come and ask me, so while all this stuff is burning down, what the heck were you doing? I want to
Exactly.
be able to give them a good answer.
Exactly.
And it also makes me doubt to what extent can we really form alliances with people that are making money in this system when we want to take it away.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you say this, but I mean, you go back in history and you look at all the people who sat in coffee shops or restaurants or campfires and thinking the same stupid thing we are, which is we'll never make this happen. But it happened. It happened because they supplied a solution that the market wanted, and the market seized. So I think there's a tendency to say, we're going to be, do you guys want to have control? I don't think that's important. I think the answer is, have we produced a solution, well, sort of like Marxism did, that the market wants? And if we produce a solution that the market wants, the market will, in other words, the population will see advantage in it. It's kind of
Well,
hard to agree with what we're saying. It's just,
I certainly want our guys, our people to be in power. I don't want to do it personally.
yes, same here. Francis, you can be in power. I don't want to be in power.
No, I know
And
enough about myself that I don't trust myself in power. If I'm in power, we're probably gonna get to the skull pile a lot sooner. You have no idea the nasty shit that's going on in my mind most of the time.
as much as I like Francis, putting Chinese men in power wouldn't align with the stated goals.
With the state that grows?
Stated goals.
Oh, the state that goes.
Okay, have we killed this one?
Yeah. All right, number 4. What are the limits between conflating IQ with brilliance? Why some people with high IQ are still dumb and people with lower IQ can be brilliant in some ways? What are other good technical measures of intelligence than IQ tests?
No, other good tests for intelligence are simple reaction times or color discrimination. And in fact, while intelligence doesn't guarantee brilliance, it is still a prerequisite for it. It's all about how you use it.
I think the author or the person asking this question is conflating brilliance with wisdom.
Correct.
Okay, this ambiguate then.
Well, wisdom for me means the. Good question. Okay, so first let's talk about brilliance. So, my definition of brilliance is be able to see creative solutions where others fail to do so.
Yes.
Whereas wisdom comes more from experiences, whether you accumulate in your own lifetime or just by listening to others, that you can discern patterns, especially in human interaction, and form heuristic systems to react to it without having to think too hard and get through the first principles.
Mm-hmm.
And be able to come up with the right answer. The right answer meaning the one that works 80-90% of the time.
Well, we all, I think about this. Here's how I look at this issue. There are guys who master their craft because they remember, they find interest, they find techniques that do things better, interesting. Like I'm talking about a drywall guy, which drywall is just above painters in the construction business, right? I mean, and painters are just above the guys who sweep the floors, right? So this is considered a low status thing. But there are guys who are really good at these things, right? Now, is that intelligence or conscientiousness? Right? Or is it?
Intelligence still helps. It helps.
No, I'm not trying to falsify that, Martin. I'm trying to create a spectrum for people to understand. He's applied his intelligence to a domain where he's intelligence. He's applied some sense of conscientiousness, and he's applied some sense of novelty seeking. Those three things to his basic job, whatever he's doing. And so you look at these craftsmen, and they have enough intelligence, right? But they still produce great stuff. My favorite guys are car guys, right? You meet these car guys, and they have like 105 IQ or something, right? But they know everything about everything in a car, right? Everything, right?
Including how they works, the new models, what's so brilliant about the model, and I mean they must either they read enough to understand how it works, or they've more likely hands-on work them and then took
Right.
away took apart the transfer cases and so on to see how it works.
Now,
They didn't design it,
no,
but they know what's going on with the cars.
yes. And so in the first case, it's a very simple thing, like the mudding and things like that with a plasterer, right? With a car guy, it's a complicated thing, right? Above that, you get a guy who can design or alter a thing, right? And beyond that, you have a thing that can design a complex thing, right? And above, so you just keep going with the scale. And what's happening is how abstract on one dimension, right, and how complex on the other dimension is it that people are doing the exact same thing, which is um, observing, novelty seeking, improvement seeking, and getting joy out of it, right? Getting fulfillment out of that. That it's really a form of dominance expression, right? You're getting your dominance expression of fulfillment of successfully achieving something. So there's just this spectrum of it. So in the reason I have a problem with this whole anti-IQ thing is that it's the same thing with the IQ versus conscientiousness thing. You're going to make more money if you're conscientious, regardless of your IQ, right? The second thing is that your IQ just determines the abstraction under which you can be excellent. You can be excellent as a mutter, taper and mutter, right? You can be excellent as a guy who fixes cars. You can be a guy who designs solutions to new parts. You can go, you can move up this tree. Um, and I'm using mechanical stuff because it's easier to understand. But your intelligence can express anywhere along the spectrum. The question is, are you using your intelligence in your spectrum? That's all. Because one of the things I don't like about this whole IQ and everybody goes to college and whatever crap is that first of all, uh, you try to be competent above your level of competency with too much education, and we've seen how that plays out with credentialism. The second thing is it demonstrate what I think the real guys are really asking here is demonstrated competency is different from credentialed competency. In other words, your ability to do what we're talking about is different from your ability to do the job. Um, Third, uh, when you're looking at this spectrum, humans divide the labor of time and space, right? Time, space, complexity, population. It's actually four properties. So we need people to be excellent at all of these points. We don't need everybody to be excellent like here and not excellent there. We need people to be excellent. So we need to sort to where we're excellent. And that's the advantage of it. So I've met guys that I would consider not very bright that are brilliant in their jobs, right? Bright in my sense, but in their jobs, they're fantastic. And I do this all the time. I mean, you get to a point where if you have money, you pay people to do things you know you could do if you spent time at it. But the fact is, they've already spent the time at it and they're better than you are.
Yeah.
So I don't like this whole thing. I mean, the whole issue is, regardless of what you're doing, are you good at it? The real issue we face in modernity is the opposite problem, which is midwintery. Is it people who have been educated but they're still incompetent? Those people have undue confidence in what they're doing because it's not demonstrated. My favorite one out there is that video where they put a bunch of people together and they're supposed to line up according to what their IQ is and guess each other's IQ. And the chick with all the degrees is the dumbest person in the room.
Which actually makes me wonder how they got those degrees. I guess none of the degrees are in hard STEM.
Well, I mean, in this case, I think it was something to do with biology. I don't know. Biology isn't that hard, right? Um, not compared to like nuclear engineering, right? And the guy that she was insulting was had joined the military, had no college degree, and he had 135
Hmm.
IQ, right? Why? Because it was interesting for him, right? And so uh, the problem, this credentialism problem creating midwittery, is what I consider the problem of our age. I don't think people with IQs that are in the 90s and they're so good at what they do should be ashamed of anything other than they're good at what they do. But then again, I have the Western tradition in my mind is that we all need to do our duty, right? And as long as we do our duty, we're all better off. Um,
Yeah,
but we don't. Go ahead.
the way I see it, to use the car analogy, right? The way I see it, we need people who are excellent at every position along that what did you call it? That
Spectrum?
surface, that spectrum. Right?
Yes.
It's actually it's two spectrums, at
Yes.
least two, right? We need people who are excellent at every point on those on that 2D surface, on that
Yeah.
spectrum, so that we can have the greatest area in terms of evolutionary computation.
Correct.
And to take that car analogy further, you can have instead of using Ferrari, I'm going to say a Porsche GT3 with what makes it what, 500 horsepower or something ridiculous, and that car can be running at 10% or 5% throttle and going at 30 miles an hour, and you can have a pickup truck going at 60, max throttle. So in one case, or let's say Econobox, right? So in one case, you have your IQ is like the horsepower of the engine, and your conscientiousness is the amount of throttle.
Correct. Correct.
So
That's really
there's no doubt that the GT3 can go faster, but if the person with the high IQ just lounging around all day, well, they're not going to accomplish much.
that's right.
Versus, let's say, someone with a 105 IQ, right, little Econobox, if they max out the throttle, well, guess what? They can go pretty far and pretty
Yeah.
fast. But no one is going to mistaken the GT3 with the Econobox, or rather
Correct.
what they could do.
Right.
But
That's
then
great.
you also have a different job. Like the GT3, that's meant to be a race car, to be really good at doing the speed thing. On the other hand, let's say a semi pickup, you're not going to make the GT3 do the job of that car and vice versa.
Correct. So I mean, so I know why these questions get asked. They get asked because um, there are conservatives who are offended by the IQ issue. Or actually everybody can be, but I mean the real answer is if you're conservative, you're probably empirical, right? Right. In other words, you're observation based, right? And where if you're progressive, you're probably utopian or ideal. Barton's going to argue with me about the meaning of conservative.
Well, I distinguish conservatives and the right. Conservatives are just tradition based, which I guess is sort of empirical on a long enough time scale. But then if they're terrible traditions, then they'll stick to those two.
I'd have to I'd have to I'd have to have some examples of it, but I guess
Right now, conservatives think that worshipping MLK is conservative.
all right, I'm gonna move on. Um, so in any event, if you're looking at the world as it is instead of the world as you wish it was, in other words, wishful thinking, I think you have an advantage in demonstrated competency. The difference is if you're a progressive, you may have an advantage in undemonstrated competency and instead an advantage in conformity. And so this is the problem, is that we are in a period of midwintery credentialism, uh, supported by midwintery credentialism, and we're lacking demonstrated competency and feedback loops. And so we're not in a period where causality, in other words, competency and causality, independent of conformity, are helpful. So I think you want to look at the world from that lens instead. All right, have we killed this one yet?
All right, let's move on. Question 5. Arthur Danto posited that the history of art reached an end when it became self-conscious and pluralistic, breaking away from a linear progression of movements. From a proprietarian perspective, do you see a parallel in how societies evolve, transitioning from rigid structure to a phase of pluralistic, self-aware governance? Could this be seen as a cultural end of history where traditional hierarchy norms dissolve, and how might this impact societal cohesion and the role of shared narratives in maintaining order?
Well, as far as I can see, societies have always evolved in the opposite direction, towards more rigid centralization until it ceases to be manageable. Collapse tends to follow, restoring the centralization. Those hierarchical norms are actually part of pluralistic societies. There are multiple hierarchies existing beside each other. Whereas this centralization is producing one mass society and pushing everyone down other than some elite that controls the whole thing.
Too many directions to go here.
How that corresponds to art, so that's not my area.
I would say that I was taught art theory, and I've read everything on art theory up until like 2020. Everything meaningful, but if you were to go to the library or go to the indexes and search for works on art theory, you'd be surprised how few there are. There's a lot of commentary, but there isn't any systemic thinking. There's not much systemic thinking on it. I went to an art school, which, believe it or not, was founded on the predication of Rand's work. Those who refounded on the dedication of Rand's work on the Romantic Manifesto, wherein she tries to address this issue or reverse the issue that Danto brings about. And so his argument is one of the arguments. It's one of the frames to use: self-conscious and pluralistic, breaking away. Yeah, this is true. From a proprietary perspective, do you see a parallel? Well, Martin sort of touched on this, but generally what happens is a core group forms a polity or a state or a civilization because they've discovered an economic or strategic advantage. They're usually combined. And they rise up in wealth, and this drags a middle class into being, this drags the lower classes into something which allows the middle class to begin to form and expand, because the middle class, it does all the trade. Then what occurs is you get we call the Peter principle, the same basic idea all over the place, which is that people are no longer trying to overcome stressors. They're trying to seek novel stimuli. In other words, overcome something to hyper-consume something. And so what you get is the emergence of decadence in civilizations if they get wealthy enough. The decadence can emerge wherever it's economically possible. So in some civilizations, it'll emerge at the top, decadence at the top, because they're able to exploit from the bottom. Now, it'll happen in the middle, which is really what's happened here, is that you have a middle class becomes disproportionately wealthy off trade, or it can happen at the bottom, which becomes disproportionately wealthy because of the aggregate condition of the population. And so in this pyramid, you can see hedonism emerge in one place, multiple places, all places.
You can even have those at the top spread this decadence to the middle so that they are pushed down into lower class.
Correct. So my point being that societies generally evolve like all markets to the point of exhaustion, which is different from how Martin positioned it a little bit, and that they have collected so many forms of consumption, hyperconsumption, corruption, virtue signaling, and hedonism, right? There's some, I'm just giving these examples in the hierarchy until a shock comes about, and whether it's military or strategic or climatological or plague or interruption of trade routes or competing technology or I mean, who knows? There's a lot until a shock comes, and all that capital that they've had before, all that income, all that wealth, is allowing all this nonsense to happen, and nobody wants to move down. So they accelerate their hedonism to the point at which it is sustainable, to the point at which it's not sustainable, and they start blaming each other. They chose conflict, and then there's either a war or collapse. So, how do we relate that pattern to art? It's the same pattern. What you saw there now, the problem with art is it's partly technological, partly economic, and partly ideological. Painting was the way you did things, or drawing, and etching or printing was the way you did things for a very long time, right? Sculpture, painting, drawing, it's how you capture things. So portraits, etc. What happened then was the advent of photography, which caused what you think of the expressionist movement, which is the use of color and exaggeration and tones, to continue the value of painting. Then there was more demand for wealth. In other words, the rise of the middle class created demand for art, which meant that it had to work from being monumental and expensive, paid for by the aristocracy, or non-monumental but still expensive, like in the mass production of Dutch masters' paintings, or the cheaper version, which is etchings and prints. It moved into being where you had to decorate apartments, and then you do houses with in New York and other urban centers. So people wanted to show their status by possessing art. So when that happened, the input into art had to decrease. In other words, the cost of production had to decrease in order to produce the variation, and the types of innovation that had to move were different. And this is where I think the what's his name? What were we talking about? Danto is coming in. You no longer were saying the aristocratic narrative. You were basically went all the way down to non-narrative. So I think of Jackson Pollock, which is the guy who did scribbly lines, right? And Mark Rothko, who just did big blocks of color. You end up with moving from art to decoration, because art's expensive and decoration is cheap. So this decline happened, And then this went further into more people wanting to participate in creating this decoration, and it went into uh, uh, experimental art, which is basically attention seeking. It's not art, it's just attention seeking. And then once that was exhausted, it went into editorialization, which is critique. And we are still in the period of critique and criticism. And that transition was partly fostered by the Marxists, who intentionally sought to destroy the European ethic, the European art system, the European aristocracy, and all our values that went along with it. And so the Marxists applied their sedition to art as well as they did to every other institution we had. So, uh, from a proprietary, do you see a parallel? Yeah, I see the parallel, which is of course obvious. And could this be seen as a cultural end of history? Yes, of course. Where traditional norms dissolve? Well, I would say that traditional norm basically means a way of creating capital. And of course, a traditional norm of creating capital has been undermined. And so, yes, hierarchical norms dissolve. And how might this impact social cohesion in the role of shared narratives? Well, it's the destruction of shared narratives. What they're really doing is as this pyramid of the top, the middle, and the bottom move upward, um, you're doing the same thing we have with men and women in the 20th century, is that we've got enough wealth so that men and women don't converge, they diverge. We get enough wealth so a culture doesn't converge, it diverges, because humans are like any other, like flocking school birds or schools of fish, seeking new stimulation and opportunity. So, we're just following the normal cycle that we see. So your intuition, I don't know who asked this question, it doesn't say here. Uh, so who the person who asked this question, it's an insightful question, it's an intelligent question, it's the kind of question I love to answer. It makes reference of an intellectual who's actually addressable rather than a vague concept. So I'm quite happy. I love this question, and your intuition is correct all the way around. I've just explained why it's correct.
I prefer avoiding attributing to cycle when it's a result of intentional actions of parasites who have names. But I guess you can say that it's part of the cycle that those parasites can get in and influence the civilization.
I don't have a comment there, Martin. I don't know what to say. All right, have we killed this one?
Yeah, I think so. All right. We have time for one, maybe two more. Depends on the question. All right, question 6 from Anon. What is the analyzed stance on National Socialism as an innovation congruent with that of the innovation of the modern state by England and rule of law by the Greeks?
Well, as always, not analyzed stance, my stance. I see it as another managerial system. Granted, compared to communism and managerial liberalism, it comes off as the least bad of the three, seeing as it actually has interests of the nation instead of some parasitic oligarchy as an end. And dictatorship is what it takes to fight the type of threat Germany was up against. But over time, it is vulnerable to getting an error-prone or outright hostile management. And so at least my goal here is for our people to live in non-managerial states that don't interfere with their lives. This doesn't mean some libertarian free market individualist utopia. It means many self-governing and within possibility self-sufficient intermediate institution that state isn't allowed to dictate to.
I want to hug you, Martin. That was really good.
Thanks.
I think I would alter the question slightly. What is the NL stance of socialism as innovation congruent with that of the modern state by England, rule of law by the Greeks? I would say you have to look at it as they did, which is that the English had invented the modern state, rule of law state, but they're an island, right? They're an island. They're a naval country. They're an island. the French the Americans responded with more of the same and codified it further. So there's sort of the Anglo version. The French, who are Catholic instead of Protestant, killed off their or exported their Protestants, killed off their aristocracy, and went for socialism, which is sort of the Catholic version versus the Protestant version of modernity. So they maintained a sort of they tried to maintain the benevolent management of the church, independent of the martial management of the state, and they merged the two together. The Germans came along and invented something that was equally Protestant, but more territorial, is they came along with Kant and Hegel and these guys. And so they were created just as the Catholic central state in France had developed, the Germans developed philosophical rationalism as a reform of Protestant, independent Protestant Bible understanding. And so they developed more of a cultural or philosophical system than the French authoritarian state one or the English upper middle class classical liberal one. The Jews came along, and the first they had Mendelssohn, is that his name? And then Mendelssohn, which tried to reform their law, and then the German Jews came up with Marxism. Now, there's a reason this happens in Germany, and if you read The Arms of Krupp, which is a wonderful book, if you can wade through its pages, Germany really invented most of what we would call benevolent socialism by the private sector. And it was promoted, oddly enough, by Krupp, who was probably originally from a Jewish family, but either changed it or did it when he moved from Holland to Germany. And the Arms of Krupp, that's basically, the Krupp was the military, it was the military industrial foundation of Germany. So he did things like got workers homes, made sure that they had health care and all this other nonsense, right? The pensions. So who was a very paternal view, continuing the German paternal and aristocratic view. And so so they had this system set up. Then Marx comes along, and he takes that model and turns the volume up to 11, so to speak, with communism. And communism isn't successful in Germany, even though it's a good movement. There's sort of French is more of the German version of French socialism, which was not as much, which was more individual responsibility instead of like the French, which was more state responsibility. And so you get this Marxist thing, which doesn't succeed, but then goes and does succeed in Russia. So from the Germans' perspective, they're sitting there, they've been conquered by Napoleon, they've unified, they've become the foundation, they've become basic academic leaders in Europe. They've become the center of the second industrial revolution, but they have a weak state because Germany's always had a weak state because it's always been distributed, and that's partly because of geography. So from the Germans' perspective, they see this strong state under communism, this strong state under liberalism, mostly because of economics, this strong state under French, this strong state emerging as fascism in Italy. And they're sort of looking at this as like, which way do we go? Because these guys are all around us and they have a stronger state than we do, even though we're better, and they were better. And so which one of those things are you going to choose in their position? Do you choose Anglo-liberalism of an island people that's primarily naval, right? And do you let those people go off in all directions? I mean, that's how Germany formed originally. That's why it has so much influence on Eastern Europe. Do you choose the French model, which is really would be a reversal of a German Protestant Reformation by re-empowering the state um, as a without individual responsibility, or do you take the Italian method, which is self-defensive and combine and gets the state involved uh, in the economy such that the state can defend itself against all these people around it? Or do you go to communism, which of course, in their view, is the worst goddamn, most irresponsible, personally irresponsible thing that is most likely to generate hostility. So from their standpoint, they chose what was logical. I think we're seeing the revitalization of National Socialism, revitalization of even Hitler. We're seeing it now. We've predicted this. Other people have predicted it in the past. We've predicted now. And as Martin says, other than the tendency to do stupid things, which is common to all forms of government, uh, it looks like they were right about almost everything. Um, and I don't mean putting people in camps and all the other stuff, but certainly getting rid of people is a common that are hostile to you is a common practice throughout history. There's nothing special about them doing that. I just think that the basic issue was that fascism occurred during the age of industrialization, and especially once industrial military had been produced at scale, then it became a risk. And so I view it, and I view National Socialism uh, as the optimum political order, if, in other words, optimum political ideology. And it's hard to argue with it if you look at how people felt under it, or the results of it, other than its military defeat. And its military defeat was only necessary because they felt that they were going to be conquered again, like they'd been conquered by Napoleon, and so they've used it out of self-interest. So I don't know. I don't know if like you said, Martin said, NLI doesn't have a stance, but I think if you ask most of us, we come along with some on Martin's statement, and that it looks like a very good way of making the state and the people, in other words, the people themselves, not only a goal but a religion, and a religion that is a religion and a state and an economy that seeks to be best for all. Really hard to argue with.
Yeah, the defeat certainly had nothing to do with the system or with the ideology, but simply running out of resources.
Correct.
It's just a matter of like GDP, and
Yep.
especially in the industrial age, where before the invention of precision guided munitions, where technology has an edge, it's just throwing numbers. It's the number of tanks you can create, the number of boots that you can field on the ground, and so on.
So my view to close my side of it is that we should not have entered either the World War. America should not have entered it. It was a European problem, and the world would be better if Germany had won World War One, and we wouldn't have had World War Two. And that would be I think that's the best answer. If we had to enter World War One, I would have said we shouldn't have entered World War Two. Um, we should let that roll out because, as far as I can tell, Germany was simply trying to restore its position that had been taken from it by the French under Napoleon. And Germany is the core of Europe. It's where we're all from.
Well, that is perhaps why it had to be destroyed.
Yep, of course. All right.
All right, did we nail that one?
Yep.
Do we have time for one more?
Maybe.
All right, let's do one more. Question 7. What were the differences between Northern and Southern European group evolutionary strategy, and how did they affect New World colonization? Would South America have been better off if it had been colonized by England?
The differences are minor if you compare to other civilizations, to other races. But one key difference I'm aware of would be between types of family, where the northwest of Europe, beyond Hagen line, practice absolute nuclear family and individualism associated with this. But what made the biggest difference in South America is that Spaniards and Portuguese didn't bring their own women.
Very smart. I would say that the problem was they essentially maintained feudalism in South America. And that's not just my opinion. I think that's every historian's opinion, and it's for the reasons Martin mentioned. But they basically maintained feudalism in a serious concentration into a small minority of the population. So they were too far behind in the development of middle class. Same thing happened in Spain, by the way, and for different reasons. It happened in Spain because the extraordinary wealth that came over from the Americas uh, gave them cash without having to develop a middle class, and then they spent all the money on wars, especially wars against the Netherlands um, and the Dutch, and they essentially fell behind, and they have not caught up yet.
I definitely see some positive aspects of feudalism, but yes, it obviously doesn't produce a material wealth.
Well, let's go with that, Martin. Let's talk about the benefit of feudalism. I mean, would the world be better off if we still had some semblance of nobility and aristocracy, in that there were people who were actually responsible for you, rather than a government who tries not to be.
Yeah, and established hierarchies where you know your place and don't constantly have to compete with national or global market.
Yep.
Or,
So there's value.
Guilds that ensure quality of products as well as conditions for employees.
Right.
Those were things that were lost.
Yep. So, what you're saying is basically it produces what Marx would call alienation. I totally agree with you. I think it's brutal to throw average people into the market. Not average. The lower third of the population in the market. It's brutal to throw them on. Germany seems to have solved that problem, but in the West we haven't. The rest of the West we haven't. All right. And did we do our? You got something? Anybody got anything else? Because I think that's.
I'll just say that I seek some mixed system.
What?
So just that I seek some mixed system as a solution, and certainly not restore medieval feudalism. That is probably not doable.
I would reframe it this way. There's an optimal system for every segment of the populace.
Yes.
Instead of one solution fit all, which is essentially what modernity is pushing for, we ought to be able to find solutions for each segment. And that's a better solution than just one size fits all.
That's right.
Right. So it's not just about best system for every class, but whether they're actually compatible, which is not clear.
All right. So did we do it? Are we on? Did we hit our time?
Yeah. Well, we got 3 minutes to spare, and Curt, I want you to stay after for a couple of minutes and talk to you about something.
All right. So we're going to shut down now. Do I do my closing?
Yes, please.
All right, everyone. Thanks for that. We got through 7 questions today. It's again Friday, October 25th, 2024. It's been our office hours Q&A session. We hold them every 2 weeks. The link to submit your questions is in the I don't know what is that description below. Please put your comments in. The guys will. I don't know which of you does this. Put them into the document here, and I guess we don't have to curate them much anymore, according to you
Nope.
guys.
No,
Right?
we didn't have to curate them for like the entire year now. We only got, I think the only time that we had people asking dumb questions, not dumb questions, but rather offensive or whatever, is right at the beginning when I think I posted the link on Twitter or some other public forum that attracted a bunch of teenage boys who were just there to have fun.
Oh, okay. All right. So please leave your questions. There's a lag, of course, but we love them. And what I just want to thank the audience for the quality of the questions. They get better every time.
Absolutely.
All right. So it's Francis, Martin, and Curt for the Natural Institute. Thank you for joining us.